What he's doing is creating a system where America is basically giving up on Europe entirely and saying, if we believe in spheres of influence, what we want to do is to be able to dominate our sphere, dominate anyone else around the world. If it's Russia, they've got to get on well with us. And Europeans will be left in a position where they will be much less secure unless they come together, which they're starting to do, but come together in a way that maybe does not rely as much on NATO. And that is going to be a complex challenge for us. But the net result of it will be that America will not have allies to stand with it when it needs them, whether it's in the Pacific region or potentially in parts of the Middle East or other parts of Europe where many Europeans don't want to get involved alongside America.
I suppose the question that I'd like to put to Scott and Alistair and Sir Robin, I mean, I did any questions last night. There was obviously a lot of discussion about this. Jared Baker, who's the editor of the Wall Street Journal, was on it. And Robin, look, he made the point quite assertively that we might not like what Donald Trump is doing, and our sense of, liberal, ideology might not like it. But he was saying that Europe had failed to spend sufficiently on defence, that we had been kind of constantly sucking the teat of America when it came to defence, that we had become almost infantilized in terms of looking after our own borders, and that Europe had, and the EU had allowed Russia to expand into Europe and to take chunks of Ukraine and now into this war. And actually that Donald Trump was having to do this because of the I suppose the impotence of the old world order in terms of rules and alliances. He was kind of arguing that these alliances had done nothing. Is there any merit in that argument, just as opposed to sort of put the other point of view across?
Well, as always, I think it's half right. I think Gerard's absolutely right that we have been infantilized, and Trump channels that smoldering underlying anger that Europeans have spent 40, 50, 60 years, certainly the period since the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990, investing in ourselves and not investing in our future security, while America, with its much more global outlook, has invested in its security. And yes, we didn't spot, as Europeans, the turn, at least many people didn't spot the turn in Vladimir Putin's outlook, so that when he began his invasions in 2014 of Ukraine, we were completely unprepared for it and have been playing catch up ever since. So that bit's all correct. But the idea that what Donald Trump is doing, beyond waking us up and making us realize we do need to spend more on defense, which I'll take Carlos Ann's point and Gerard's point on this. But what he's doing is creating a system where America is basically giving up on Europe entirely and saying, if we believe in spheres of influence, what we want to do is to be able to dominate our sphere, dominate anyone else around the world. If it's Russia, they've got to get on well with us. And Europeans will be left in a position where they will be much less secure unless they come together, which they're starting to do, but come together in a way that maybe does not rely as much on NATO. And that is going to be a complex challenge for us. But the net result of it will be that America will not have allies to stand with it when it needs them, whether it's in the Pacific region or potentially in parts of the Middle East or other parts of Europe where many Europeans don't want to get involved alongside America. So, yes, we need to spend more on defense. Trump has made that absolutely clear, and he's helping us kick us up the backside to do it. But the net result is that there will not be a structure in which America can then cooperate with allies afterwards, so both of us can keep strong.
One of our listeners just made a very astute point, I think, pushing back, which is a fair point. There has been this narrative that, NATO and Europe have done nothing for America, that we've just been, and I think the words freeloaded was used last night. This listener says, actually, NATO was there for America after 9/11, and Denmark, pro ratio, had more dead on Afghan soil than any other nation. I think that's a really important point. I mean, certainly, look, Iraq was incredibly controversial. The Labour Party paid a heavy price. Tony Blair is still besmirched for his, unrestrained support for America. So it's not true to say that Britain has never ever been there for America and that Europe has never ever been there for America. Alistair, I suppose just continuing Gerard Baker would laugh if he heard me now because we had quite a big ding dong about this, but I'm trying to be even-handed as I chair this debate and just to put all points across. There will also be a school of thought, probably from people trying to be sort of sympathetic or understand Trump's view, which said, look, under Biden, nothing was happening. Nothing was happening on Gaza. Nothing was happening on Ukraine. World leaders just collectively would gather at these G7 events and these meetings and just would look, again, that word impotent. I mean, is there any argument that a more interventionist attitude is going to sort of move things forward and that, we had all collectively become too hands off?
As Robin, there is some truth that needs to be navigated in relation to this. As far as the Middle East is concerned, one thing we haven't raised yet is Trump's action in 2020 to kill Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC in Iran. There are some who would trace Iran's current weakness right back to that, which was almost a unilateral move to remove someone who had been the architect of Iran's malevolent policy around the region, and Iran's decline and what we saw subsequently with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria might be traced back to that. So there is some argument in relation to intervention, but the history of interventions has not been good.
Yeah.
We can't gloss over Afghanistan and Iraq. It was Trump himself who said these were terrible mistakes by the United States. So he is now picking and choosing where he's intervening. We don't yet know what the consequences will be in Venezuela in terms of civil action. We don't know what will be the outcome in Iran. And as far as I'm concerned, it's much better to leave that to internal forces. Ultimately, I mean, Stephen Miller was talking the other day about the iron law of the world from when time began, is that force always wins. Well, I'm not sure you can say that this afternoon in Iran. The iron law of the world is that oppressed peoples sooner or later rise up.
Although let's see what happens with that, Alistair. I mean, let's hope that happens. But
that's right. But I just wanted to raise a couple of other things, if I may. The listener who came to you and spoke about, is the world now being split up into three zones, Russian, Chinese and the US? I've got some sympathy with that. I'd like Robin's view on that. I'll say this straight away. I think if China invades Taiwan, the United States will do nothing. I don't think now there will be a military invention by the United States to save Taiwan. I think they are dividing the world up into spheres of influence, and if they leave each other's spheres alone, they will leave each other alone. I think we have moved into that sort of sphere. And in relation to the question of whether the UK now has to consider the United States in the future, what happens if the Democrats win? Well, firstly, I don't think Democrats are going to win because the present Republican cabal running America can't afford to lose. And I think if you look ahead, if you see Vance and Miller and people like that, the United Kingdom had better get used to the fact that Republicans are going to look like Trump for a long time. And we're going to have to now make our calculations on the basis we can't defend on a United States who used to use its force for collective values, but now appears to be using it solely at its own discretion in its own interest. That has changed the world a great deal. And I think we do have to now bring that into our calculations of our own defence. And it's going to cost people in Britain rather more than it has in the past.
Scott, what do you think of what Alistair has just posed? There's some really interesting points there from Alistair about these three spheres of influence. And also, we all might be kind of hoping that the pendulum will swing in America. It might not.
I think we need to add a layer on this, which is we've focused a lot on Donald Trump, understandably, right? But we're not talking about just Donald Trump. We are talking about a Trump administration. And that is an administration where even if Trump wants to rule like a mob boss, both in America and in the world, not everybody in the administration is part of his family. I think J.D. Vance, the vice president, I think Stephen Miller, this very important advisor, are very much like Trump. Indeed, probably even more important than Trump in terms of scheming for this type of American domination and this belief in no alliances. But there are many people in the American government who still value alliances, still value cooperation. I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio does, and I think Rubio's trying to navigate his position with them. But I think also a lot of career officials, the ones that haven't been able to purge in the State Department, in the military, in the Treasury, in the intelligence services do as well. So let me give you one example of where this adds layers to this. Despite Donald Trump's affinity in the past for Vladimir Putin, and despite a couple of his advisors, notably Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, being even more fond of Putin, we're actually at a point now where Europe and Ukraine have been able to pull the United States into security guarantees or potential security guarantees to defend Ukraine against the Russian invasion, and where U.S. intelligence agencies are providing intelligence sharing, not only to defend Ukraine, but to carry out attacks inside Russia. And that happened because Ukraine and Europe could identify the people within the administration who did not want to go the way of just dividing up the world. They wanted to go the way of still maintaining some type of collective security. And that's why I think, especially to take on Robin's point, which is that if domestic issues do not go well for the Republicans in 2026, they may start to peel away from Trump. There is space here to talk to the adults in the room in the United States.
Okay.
Still some adults in the Republican Party and those career officials. And that, I think, may be our silver lining as we consider what to do next.
Okay, a bit of silver lining there. Or, I'm not saying this in a rude way, Scott, but I'm just trying to be objective. Or, and I include myself in this, maybe optimism bias. I mean, I think we just have to be kind of, honest about that. Robin, what are your thoughts on this idea of the kind of these three spheres of influence?
Look, historically, there is a root to them and a reality to them. Russia's biggest sphere of influence was the Soviet Union, and some believe that Vladimir Putin is trying to reclaim as much of it as he can right now. The United States had its period, which Donald Trump obviously feels most comfortable with. William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, the Monroe Doctrine. That was that whole period of deciding the Western Hemisphere was for America to dominate. And obviously China is trying to regain that phase where it dominated Southeast Asia and East Asia, the kind of tributary system they had rather than colonies. So there is a historical rooting and a reality, and most of human history and political history has been built around big powers dominating their spheres. What I would say is that in a global world, one in which we trade globally, which technology moves globally, information moves globally, people move globally, it ain't gonna work. And one of the main reasons for it is that these spheres of influence overlap. They're not distinct. You can't say you have this, I have that. Donald Trump is not going to give Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. There's no deal. Each of them wants to own it. I'm not saying I particularly like Donald Trump's designs on Ukraine at certain moments either, but at least he is defending it right now. Alistair Burt and I think Scott both made some very important points on this a minute ago. Japan. President Trump may not want to defend Taiwan, but where does he draw the line? Where does he draw the line on defending the Pacific wing of his hemisphere? If Japan is inside, if South Korea inside, that's a contested period with China, and the Chinese are trying to put a lot of pressure on Japan right now. So wherever you look, these spheres of influence, including Greenland, are going to overlap. And they're going to be contested, which means, and this gets to the other question you received earlier, I think post-Trump, actually, even if we end up with some version of a J.D. Vance or a Stephen Miller kind of cabal, personally, I think they're probably going to go when Trump goes. But let's say they were to carry through. America cannot protect its hemisphere without allies. Now, they may want to be dominating their allies. They may not want to, be particularly friendly towards them. But my money, if I was to put it down in terms of this question, would be in the future, America will realize it can only take on China and Russia with allies. It's not big enough to do it without them. And it won't be able to protect its hemisphere without them either. So hemispheres overlap. You can't divvy up the world in a 19th century way. We're too interconnected.
Fascinating stuff. I'm just going to read out some messages. We've got so many messages coming in. Peter says, hi Aisha, international law always seems to have been a bit of a fiction with the baddies ignoring it and the liberal democracies tying themselves in knots over it. The USA now seems to have joined the baddies. Can international law survive? That's Peter Marcus has messaged in saying Trump is literally stealing the natural resources of another country. We should start considering sanctions against such open breaches of international law. Donald Mackenzie from Inverness has a slightly different take. He says, if the people who already hated President Trump were excluded from taking up bandwidth attacking Mr. Trump in Greenland, we would hear from many who think his ideas have merit. Could the USA defend Greenland from Russia more than Denmark? Well, yes. Could joining the USA instead of Denmark give a fillip to Greenland? Also, yes. It may sound like an odd idea for the USA to take over Greenland, but it is not that crazy. That's Donald from Inverness. And it is important to hear other views. So, Donald, thank you for messaging that in. Barry says, I thought if Putin has something on Trump, then Trump's move to destroy Nato could be a great favour to Putin. And an interesting message here from an anonymous listener, but it is interesting. He says, us older people are more aware of our history of the 20th century. The USA did not come into World War I until 1917 or World War II until 1941. The USA didn't suffer the terrible bombing or ground fighting which devastated much of the UK and European countries. The USA made money from supplying armaments. Europe was in debt after 1946, while America was free to get rich in comfort. George Osborne made a mistake when he allowed the British Armed Forces to be depleted so that he could claim we were suffering from austerity, whereas he was really reducing taxation for the very rich. No one can rewrite 20th century history. It is well documented. So lots of interesting questions coming in there. Just what someone's messaging, quite an interesting question. Robin, I'll just come back to you and I'll bring in Alistair and Scott briefly at the end, but briefly, if you will, Robin. We've talked a lot about Europe, America, the Arctic, Asia. What about Africa?
My quick comment on Africa deserves more than a quick comment. I think Europe's future is inextricably linked to the future of the African continent. It is our vertical, if I can call it that. And the amazing thing is I think Europeans have more to offer Africa than China or America. We need African countries to move up the value chain, not just exporting minerals and commodities, but actually starting to make money out of them so the people in Africa get wealthier. There will then be less migration. Climate change will have less impact. So what I would say, we never spend enough time talking about it, but as a European, we need to focus on the future of Africa and look for partnerships there. It's going to be difficult, but our future is connected with Africa's future.
What we might do, Robin, is we may invite you back. We might do another segment on Africa, because I think that would be a useful thing to do. We'll schedule that in. Look, we're coming to the end of our time. Let's get some kind of closing thoughts from Alistair and Scott. Alistair.
Just to say, to go along the same line that Robin was taking, we haven't spoken much about the Middle East. The Middle East does need Trump at the moment. It was Trump who forced Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to get to the ceasefire, which has given Gaza a chance. Now, the eye has been off Gaza for the last few weeks because the eye has been on other places. It's very important it comes back to that, because the future of the Middle East, the security and stability of the Middle East, is based on a resolution of the issue between Israel and the Palestinians, and security and stability there to the benefit of all. And so in that sense, Trump's engagement is really needed there. And we need to focus on that as well as the other things we've spoken about.
Brilliant. Scott, final word to you, just 40 seconds, please.
International law is worth defending. The international system is worth defending. But if we're going to defend it, we have to defend it, as Robin and Alistair pointed out, by treating it as truly international. And that means Europe and the UK have to look to cooperate with Africa, with the Middle East, with Latin America even, and presenting an alternative to either the US vision of domination or the Chinese vision of its own unilateral power over the world. So it's time to step up, to put our money where our mouth is in terms of cooperation, in terms of values, as well as terms of military, economic, and political investment.